Welcome back to Central News. What has growing up in New Zealand been like for you? Some may say they have really enjoyed it. For 7,000 people, researchers are getting up and close to find out what it is like growing up in New Zealand. Dr. Polly joins me now. Polly, what is growing up in New Zealand?
So growing up in New Zealand is a longitudinal study, and a longitudinal study basically means you start with a group of people, and in our case we started with pregnant mums because we are interested in their child growing up, and you follow that child or that family for a long period of time. So in our case we're following, as you said, around 7,000 children in the context of their families over around about 21 years.
So why is this research being carried out?
Well, we want to know what it's like for this new generation of children being born in New Zealand today, growing up in our country. It's quite different to how it was around 40 years ago when the last big New Zealand longitudinal study was carried out. And if we want to build successful and resilient and happy and healthy children, then we need to know what policies, what programs will build that, what would be value for money, what wouldn't, how do we target our policies and programs, and how do we make that happen.
Now, the research has been going for 5 years and some results were released in November last year. What do these results tell us, and what were they?
So the results that we released in November last year were our first set, our results. It's called Growing Up in New Zealand Before We Were Born. And they're the results of the interviews that we had with the mums and the dads of 7,000 children before they were even born. So we interviewed mum when she was around about 28 weeks pregnant, towards the end of her pregnancy, and we interviewed her partner, which was most of the time the father of that child, and we asked them all sorts of different questions about their intentions and their hopes and their dreams for that child and the environment that that child would grow up in, and that's the information that we released. So we'll be able to follow that up. That's the snapshot, that's the backdrop if you like, and we'll continue building on that as the child grows.
So how does it differ from, say, someone like pre-birth, you've got someone who's having their first child, to, say, a family that's got maybe 2 to 3 other children? How are their thought patterns different?
Well, that's exactly the kind of questions that we asked. So we asked questions around big areas that are important for child's development. We asked about the health and well-being of that family. We asked about the family structure itself. So we do in fact know that some of these children are the first child, and a lot of these children do have siblings. We ask about the education, intentions and background of the family itself. We ask about culture and identity, and we ask about all the other areas, the societal context, the community that that child's growing up in. So what we are able to do is compare those children that are solo children, or even ones that are going to have future siblings, to those that say grew up in bigger families or even extended families.
So 7,000 children have been selected. What sort of process is required of the children and the parents?
Yeah, well, we're very fortunate that 7,000 wonderful, generous families have said yes, we'll sign on for this, and we'll sign our child up for this. And what it involved to date is an interview, as I said, so it took about an hour and a half with the mum, talking to the mum face to face with an interviewer, and another sort of 45 minutes or so with the partner, with dad, and that was the pre-birth interview. We've finished the 9-month interview, and that's a similar process, although of course the baby was around then, so we got to see them, which is great. And then we're in the planning stages for the next round of interviews, which happens when the child's 2 years. And so at that stage we have a bit more of an interaction with the child. We can do their height and weight, and we can have a bit of a talk to them, for example. And that interaction with the child will grow and grow as they start to become old enough to give us their own thoughts about their hopes and dreams.
So what happens to the data and analyse? What does it tell us about growing up in New Zealand?
Well, so far this antenatal look or pre-birth look at all of these children have shown us that indeed this new generation of New Zealand children are growing up in a country that's very different to how it was a generation ago when you or I were growing up, when our parents were growing up. So at the moment what we can see is that our children are growing up into families that are really multicultural, multi-ethnic. They're growing up into families where an incredible range of languages are being spoken. 1 in 3 of our parents, for example, of these children were not born in New Zealand themselves. They were born overseas, and they may have only recently come to New Zealand before they had this child. 1 in 5 of our families are not speaking English as their main language in their homes. These children are growing up into families that are often extended families with other adults helping to look after them and providing support in the home, for example. And they're moving a lot. Around about half of the group of families had moved more than twice already in the last 5 years before this child was born. Only half of them are living in their own homes, half of them are renting. So these snapshots, if you like, across all of those areas that are important for child development show that it's very different out there for our children growing up today.
So what changes will there be made? Like, how does this research, is it hard for policymakers and government? What changes can they make from the conclusions?
Well, one of the great things, and you said, we've been going for 5 years, and one of the great things we've managed to do is build those relationships with the policymakers, the program developers from the very start. So every time we find something out or we collect these stories from the families, that's fed into the policies that are being developed at the moment, and so they are being able to be adjusted to make sure that the evidence that we're providing about what's real out there now can help target those policies effectively.
So you're doing the research in the Auckland, Manukau and Waikato areas. What can you tell us about growing up in New Zealand in the Waikato region?
Well, we started the research in those areas because we needed to know, okay, we need pregnant women, how are we going to find them? We need to define an area that we're going to look at. But the reason why we chose those areas, and Waikato in particular, was because we want this group to represent the voices of all of New Zealand families having children today, and we've managed that. And the important aspects that Waikato have brought to us is the rural voice, for example, and also a significant percentage of our Māori children are born to families in the Waikato region. So including Waikato in there has strengthened the voice that represents all of New Zealand from those aspects. So the stories that we have reflect all of New Zealand, but if we didn't have the Waikato in there, then we wouldn't be able to make sure that it is representative.
Cool, Polly, thanks for coming on the show.
You're welcome.
Polly there from Growing Up in New Zealand. After the break we find out all about the Waikato Times Hamilton Garden Art Festival.